Check 1, 2. Return to people.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome back. We are the Return to People podcast, where we talk about success stories from leaders shaping people-first cultures in remote or hybrid companies. Today's guest is a true example of purpose-driven leadership. From serving as a Marine Rifleman to building one of the fastest growing veteran-owned businesses in the country, he's led with faith, integrity, and relentlessness, commitment to service. What started as a $2,500 contract is now a nationwide operation delivering staffing, training, and program management for federal agencies supporting veterans, military families, and underserved communities. Harbor trained, mission focused, and community rooted. Please welcome Michael Sanders.
That may have been one of the most exciting intros I've ever had, Kaleem. Thank you. That was awesome. Appreciate
man. Well,
it.
thank you. Listen, first off, thank you for your service multiple times, not just you serving in the military, but also helping all these military families. So thank you for taking the little bit of time that you have to spend with us, man. So really appreciate it. And, before we talk about what it is that you're doing in your organization, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit of your history, maybe, where you're located? How did you get where you are today, man?
Sure. Born in Salem, Oregon, was a military brat, moved around a lot when I was a kid. Currently, I'm in Wilmington, North Carolina, near Wrightsville Beach, and our headquarters is in Springfield, Virginia, but we operate in every state. And I like to lift weights. I like to golf, anything physical or fun. I like to do. I had a brief stint as a cattle farmer from 2020 to about 2023. I raised cows. So where I am today is in a great place. I like to say, my company could run without me. And I think that's where eventually most founders would like to get to. So instead of being directly involved in the day-to-day, a lot of my time is spent with wonderful people like yourself, doing podcasts, looking at SIMs, mergers and acquisitions, strategic vision. And then I get the amazing benefit of not having to ask people what they're doing, but how they're doing. So, when I check in with my staff across the country, I get, the blessing and the opportunity to actually get to know who they are and, what makes them tick and how I can make their life, their job easier, better, more efficient.
That's great, Michael. And one of the things I picked up right away when you were kind of doing, talking about where you are today is the fact that, you enjoy people, man. You enjoy people and you enjoy talking to people. And the fact that you are focused on organizing a business versus doing the work every day, kudos to you, because a lot of people struggle with that proactivity, right? Getting outside of the work and really managing the business versus doing the work. So let's talk about Interactive Government Holdings. Okay. What was the spark that made you conceptualize this idea? And what are the main challenges that people are facing when they come to you?
So funny enough, the spark was President Bush W. signed an executive order allotting 3% of government spending to go to service-disabled veterans. I was in an office, and it was a shared office space before WeWork. It was in 2004, and this guy walked by, and he looked, and he was like, "Oh, you were in the Marines?" And then he goes, too bad you're not disabled. And then he kind of thought about it for a second and was like, that came out wrong. He's like, but President Bush just signed this executive order allowing 3% of government spending to go to, service disabled vets. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I am service disabled. I got 10% for each knee. So I went and, Googled what the federal budget was and what 3% of that was, and was like, that's a lot of money. I think I'm going to be a federal contractor now.
Now, for our listeners, for our non-military listeners, what is specifically service disabled? Could you explain that just briefly?
Service disabled means that you are not the same when you got out as you were when you came in. So,
I would assume that's everyone.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I mean, my grandpa, is a 100% disabled veteran because his ears, he lost a lot of his hearing in Vietnam and, some other stuff, other physical things I don't remember, but he would have got the 100% just for his ears because
I see.
they didn't believe in earplugs back then, I guess. And he
Okay.
was in the
Yeah, for
infantry. He
sure.
was he was in the infantry, so he's almost 90 now. Still can't hear, won't wear hearing aids. So every
Yeah.
family reunion is like playing a game of telephone because you got to tell the person who's sitting
Hey,
close. Yeah, hey,
hey.
grandpa, So
So when you were doing that research and what were some of the things that kind of obviously the money was a big motivator. Was there anything else particular specifically with your own personal experience or experience from colleagues that you knew that really kind of motivated you to create the company?
at the time I was doing political consulting, and I felt some sense of like, if I can help the right people get elected, maybe I can, affect change somehow. I've always wanted to do something. I mean, I think everybody wants to do something that matters, right? They want to know they're
Yeah,
having an
yeah,
impact, whether they're,
yep.
impacting their, their family, their community, whatever it may be. You don't want to just,
Mhm.
think that your work's going into a dark hole and it doesn't really matter. So,
Right.
impact was one of those things. But again, I like to joke, I was just too young to know any better,
Mhm.
and when I started the company, I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll do the same thing I was in terms of political consulting, which we were, selling websites and outreach and, different things. And then I realized very quickly selling a website to the government is a completely different animal than to a campaign. And, you have to have all these
Yeah.
certifications and all these things. And so what is now SAM.gov used to be called FedBizOps. And anything over $25,000 has to be posted on SAM.gov now. It used to be FedBizOps, but anything over 25K by law has to be posted publicly.
Yeah. For a bid.
Yeah, to bid. And so when I first, got all signed up and got registered, I clicked, send me everything, and so I was getting these emails with like 5,000, anything from, missiles to Q-tips to toilet paper, I was looking at it all. And very quickly I was like, okay, I can't look through thousands of opportunities a day.
No.
And so I started looking at, what programs are there that,
Okay.
I could maybe hire the right people for and then manage and make better. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like I do with my kids when we're at a hotel. Like we want to leave it nicer or better than we found it,
Mhm. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so that's kind of our same mantra in terms of programs. Like we're not a set it and forget it company where we win a contract, we hire the
Mm.
people, we send them paychecks, and 5 years later maybe we recompete, maybe we don't. We take a
They
real
don't.
active interest into making sure that we're investing in our programs and our people.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So specifically, how do you help individuals? Like what's your main goal as far as helping, military families and military veterans? How do you help individuals?
So we have a portfolio of programs. We tend to call them human capital, but the overarching theme we consider non-medical case management, which encompasses
Non-medical
unemployment,
case management.
underemployment, resiliency, suicide prevention, drugs and alcohol, domestic, financial. Basically, we
Wow.
over the portfolio of our contracts, there's really nothing that a service member or a veteran or their family members could deal with that we wouldn't be able to like hook them up with either a community partner, direct resources, something. I mean, it's a little different every state, right? Like in Florida, we
Right.
specifically do employment, right? And so
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
Florida, the thing that we did there to make the program better was they used to run everything on Excel. We got everything in a database that's searchable and not non-fungible, not to make an NFC joke, but so basically that way we could look at who are the people that were actually hiring veterans, et cetera, et cetera. So bringing a little bit of innovation, which in the government space is not hard to do. Some of our programs when we
Yeah.
took them over, they were sending CD-ROMs to exchange information.
Unbelievable.
And
Wow.
not that they didn't have emails, but for large, information, they were sending
Huge
CD-ROMs.
time.
So we're like, we'll throw up a SharePoint. I mean, it
Yeah.
wasn't
Yeah.
anything, that they cost a ton
Crazy.
of. It wasn't anything that cost a ton of money, but it allowed us to take a program which was in every state and territory and then provide continuity to it. So that way that a person from Hawaii could go take over for the person from Idaho and they would know everything that they needed to
Yeah.
know who they needed to call, even though the processes were the same, the contacts and the things that were different, particular to that state, were there as well. So that's kind of, one of the first things we do is continuity.
Yeah. So that's awesome. So you don't just, a lot of people try to simplify what it is that you do. And what I like about what you just explained is no, you're not just a recruiter matching people for jobs. It sounds like you're offering a lot more services than people recognize. So that's pretty cool, man. That's pretty cool. I got a question for you as far as the flexibility.
Sure.
So we've talked earlier, and you guys had to make kind of not necessarily a tough decision, but a lot of government work is done on site, but you all have embraced a hybrid work model that provides flexibility. Can you talk about two things here? Why did you all decide to embrace hybrid work, and what was the real spark for that?
So when in 2015 we won a contract that was in every state and territory, and
Okay.
so those people have to be on site. Some of them can take a flex day. I mean, a lot of it is program requirements on contract, right? So
Correct. Correct. Out of your control.
we have to follow them, and we do try to negotiate, what makes, common sense with our customers, especially, in some states, because there may be a really talented person, but he's not really near the workstation, so maybe we try to find him a closer place, or maybe he goes in, we'll work with the customer to try to get the best benefit, to try and get, the most, talented person that we can. And then, in terms of headquarters, I love to travel, man. I love being on a plane. I love being in airports. That it's like a room with 1,000 doors to anywhere in the world. And I
I
get a
do
lot
too.
of
I love it too.
I get a lot of energy from the
Energy.
airport. Yeah, I
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah.
And
Sitting next to somebody and not knowing where they're going and they're getting something done, it kind of gets you motivated. I feel that.
yeah, and so when we won that contract in 15, it was kind of a mess. There was, like I said, people had their own little fiefdoms, and that program also has state chairs. It has the government. So there's a
Okay.
lot of stakeholders, and
Okay.
everybody, when we won that program, wanted to tell me why their state, was special, and so, so I spent a lot of time that first like year and a half, like, because that program has a lot of different things that they do in order to sort of promote the National Guard and reservists to their employees. Because, if you have a guy that works for you and he's like, hey, I gotta, I'm gone one weekend a month and I'm deuces 2 weeks during summer for annual training, they do something called a boss lift, right? And the one good example of that is we watched F-35 get refueled in midair. And, the kid that, doing this little stick that's going out to the F-35, he's 20 years old. He's 20 years old, works in, like, I think Midas, or, one of those
Yeah.
auto
Something like
repair shops. But, the thing is he messes up. That's a $35 billion airplane that goes down.
right. Right.
And so it gives the bosses this idea that the people that are working for them, there's a reason that they have to be gone, and they get to see what they do in action. And so it sort of builds the value, and it shows the true value in terms of what this person is bringing to the table. Like, this guy can
Yeah.
handle stress. Like, he's got a pilot, if things go wrong, he's got.
So trust me, they can be the assistant manager. She has to do this on the weekends. Trust me, she can be the manager of the regional office. I totally get that. So,
That's
you
right.
have this program in 50 different states. So what was the challenge for you well, not the challenge, but like, why did you decide, hey, this hybrid thing is the way to go?
So I mentioned this sort of as we were in like pre-recording, like, I have, I get to call people and ask them how they're doing, not what they're doing. We have great regional leads, we have great program managers, I have a great executive staff. So I get reports on what's going on, and that's great, because it gives me the flexibility, number one, to be on the road, meeting new customers, new clients, visiting employees, but also it gives the executive staff, like, I think autonomy is one of the greatest gifts you can give people. I don't, for our executive staff that doesn't have to, that is not required by the government, to be,
Yes.
make it's not audited that they were there. Like, I don't care if my guy gets there at 10 or if he gets there at 7. Like, it doesn't really matter to me, because it's all outcome based, right? Like, I know
Hmm.
he knows that we have these proposals that are due. He knows when the reviews are. He knows when he has to have stuff to me by. I mean, my CFO, same thing. Like, she knows that we have to have financial meetings. She knows what reports to do. She knows, so
Did you all kind of like when you started this idea and then you landed that contract in 2015? Was this an intentional way of working for you, or were you just like, hey, I'm starting this business. I don't necessarily have an office myself. I'm just going to keep building this business. And as the business grew, was it hybrid by accident, or like was it hybrid by, hey, I'm Michael, this is what I enjoy doing. And if I expect my team to be productive and based on results. Like, where did the mentality come from being results based and letting your staff do all of this work? Because most people, especially, and again, I'm doing a very generalization here, especially some former military who've been regimented to go into a place at this time every single day. How did you build this business that way?
So prior to 2015, we were doing a few $100,000 a year. When we won
Okay.
that contract, all of a sudden we're doing like 1.2 million a month. And so it
Mm.
was just like all of a sudden, like I didn't have the executive staff then. I didn't have like, we started by subletting somebody's office that
Yep.
was retiring. And then we ended up
Mhm.
just taking over the whole office when they retired about a year later. But, the whole idea is that a proposal can drop at 4:45 on a Friday. Generally, I'm not going to say it would be due Monday because they're not that fast turnarounds. But a lot of times when you get near the
Quick
end,
turnarounds.
people, they have to work weekends or they have to work late. And the thing that I love
Um,
my staff is that, I don't ever have to ask them. Like if they know they need to come in the weekend, they're like, hey, we're going to be here Saturday. We're meeting at 10, blah, blah, blah. And they tell me they're going
the
to
deadlines.
I don't have to ask them, and so, the hybrid part was intentional because one, I was traveling a lot. Some of my team was traveling, the executive team, sometimes we'd have to split, it's not split problems, but, we'd have to go,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
different people at the same time. And so,
Divide and conquer.
uh,
Yeah.
but, funny story is like, as the executive team got more mature over the last few years, and this isn't, like it took 2 or 3 iterations of trying to form an executive team that was competent and qualified and I could count on in order to get to the people
Hmm.
I have now. And now I've had my CFO, she's been with me 8 years, HR director 10 years, my
Hmm.
BDA and
Hmm.
ops people 4 or 5 years. But it took a while to get to that place. Not to where I could trust them, but to find the right people.
The right people. And this is 5 years prior to the pandemic. So you are building a hybrid slash remote team prior to, you know, the world understanding what it means. So that's really fascinating. So you talked about it just briefly just now that, you had some stumbles along the way.
Yeah,
Every
like some
person
big
wasn't the
ones.
right person. So now that you're here today, and if you're going to give a little retrospect, what has been the biggest challenge within the employee experience or the remote employee experience? What has been your biggest challenge?
I think for founders, it's what do you let go of and when, and who do you let it go to? And then you have to let it go and you have to let them do it their way, And for me, that's, I'm not a micromanager. So, and I think it kind of shocks people sometimes because, I hire them and it's kind of, like, hey, do it your way. Like, don't do it the way I was doing. And I'm not a professional ops person. Like, I hired
Yeah.
you the ops person. So and it was amazing the difference when I hired the right people because they would come in and tell me what they were going to do. They wouldn't,
Mm.
oh, well, what do you want me to do about, and I always tell the story. It's kind of funny that, when the right team got in place, I didn't all of a sudden, no one came to me with problems. It was always solutions. It was like, hey, we had this problem in Texas. We talked to the contracting officer. We talked to HR. We had a meeting with the employee. We had a meeting with the person the employee had a problem with. This is the solution. And, if it
Mhm.
happens again, everybody knows that these are the actions that are going to be taken. And, I used to be the guy they call for those problems. And so at first, like my feelings were a little hurt. I was like, well, why don't you guys call me? And they're like, they kind of looked at me like I was cross. Like they're like, why would we call you? Like we had, like we took,
We have the solution. We took care
yeah.
of it. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
when I realized that, I was like, that's right. They should be coming to me with solutions, not problems. Even though there are certain things that just have to get
Of
elevated
course.
to
Of
where I'm
course.
at. But the thing is
Autonomy.
having a staff that takes that. So with autonomy comes responsibility, right? And if you're giving autonomy but no one's taking responsibility, you have the wrong crew, right? And
Right. Right.
so
Right.
when you have autonomy and then they're taking initiative and responsibility, like
It's
it's
unbelievable.
it's the best feeling in the world as a founder and CEO. It really is.
That's awesome, man. So it sounds like, in the beginning, you're kind of there now, but really attracting the right talent for your needs was a challenge. And honestly, it takes time. And it sounds like you figured it out over time, finding those types of traits that you want. So I totally understand that. And I agree. Every culture is different. How you do things is different. Leadership styles are different. So finding talent's always a challenge, even when you're offering flexibility. So to the flip side, Michael.
Yeah.
So that was like one of your biggest challenges. What's your biggest success since you've been able to offer this flexibility to your executive staff? What has been your biggest success in that employee experience?
I go back to if I got hit by a bus today, I feel like the company could keep growing,
Congratulations.
and
That's
so
big.
for me, that's kind of a freedom, that,
That's big.
and kind of a funny story. When my CFO first came on board, we were in Guam together, and I
Mhm.
got this email about payroll, and I wigged out, and she was like, Mike, put your guns away. Like, this isn't your job anymore. And, I remember, and she talks about, having to, cause Guam's 14 hours ahead. And so it's really tricky because it's like 12 hours and then you're in the next day, so it's like,
Yeah.
is it Wednesday out over there? And I'm on Monday and, I remember the next payroll, like waking up and going, like, I forgot payroll. And then I was like, and then I was like, it's not my job anymore. And I looked and,
It's not my job.
payroll was there. And I was like, all right, like,
Wow.
I don't, cause I had been, you know, prior to
Doing
that
everything
win,
at that kind of
I
point.
was, and sometimes I was still trying to put, payrolls together sometimes, like, hey, hey, Uncle Randy, like, I need $5,000, like, I'm like a little bit short of payroll. This customer hasn't paid me yet, and so
Yeah.
before
Yeah. Yeah.
before lines of credit, before all those things, I was still putting, sometimes having to cobble payrolls together because customer may have paid, maybe hadn't paid or was paying late. Yeah, it's a great feeling to know that things are taken care of, that there's processes in place, that I don't have to have my finger on on the button or my hands on my guns, as Laura would say.
Congratulations and shout out to Laura. Shout out to Laura for having your back. That is really awesome, man. And what I just really love about that success, it sounds so simple, but for our listeners and viewers, there's a lot of owners out there who've never felt that feeling, who've never felt that feeling of, oh, don't worry. If I get hit by a bus tomorrow, the bus check, I always love the bus test. If I get hit by a bus, can we still operate? And it sounds like you focused a lot on processes, finding the right talent, which I believe is highly overlooked these days. I think a lot of people really overlooking that. So kudos to you, man.
I call it like courting. I mean, if you want to find a talent, like you almost have to romance them, I mean, because number one, they're gonna have a job, and it's gonna take a while. Like, it may take a couple years, but like that's why I think as a founder, if you really are looking for a talent and you know what type of people you like, you have to be out there finding them and then checking in on the, hey, well, what's your next step, what, and with like my BD guy, like I tried for like 3-4 years to get him before he came over, but he knew I was interested after year two. I was like, hey, before you leave, so it was, such and such place. He was working for a large government contractor.
Let us know. Let us know.
I was like, just give me the opportunity to talk to you first, and
Yeah.
then the next year I saw him at the golf tournament and he's like, I'm doing pretty good. I got a promotion, blah, blah. I was like, okay, no problem. It's like, hey man, just if you do decide you're
Yeah.
looking for something different, let me know. And then the fourth year he was like,
Hey,
hey,
I'm in.
things are changing. And I think, maybe I'd like to start having that conversation now. And so,
Michael, you don't even realize it. Well, you do realize it, but like that in itself, yes, it's recruiting, but it's also employer branding. You're out there talking about your brand. You're out there talking about what it's like to work at your company, IGH. I almost called you IHG.
People do it all the time.
So that's really cool. So last question for you. Well, not last question, but if you could start over again, is there a piece of advice that you would give to yourself? You could go back in time around the employee experience, around your people. What type of advice would you give to yourself?
When I first started, I was much more in Marine mode. It took a little while for me to cool out and to trust people. And then it also took me a little while to learn who I should trust and when I should start trusting them. And some of that came from being taken advantage of. Some of that came from missteps, and we didn't get into it, but one of my biggest mistakes, was hiring this like growth team. And, I went outside our normal processes. I did all the recruiting on my own. I was negotiating with 3-4 different people at the same time. I think I suffered a little bit of negotiation fatigue because, these people knew I wanted them, and, they were trying to get as much out of me as they could. And, after a year, they did some, they won a few things, but the thing is that I eventually had to let them all go. And, I had to do a deconstruction. Okay, why did this fail? And I started, I had to let everybody go. Why? And I started working backwards. And, what it came down to is I didn't follow our processes. I didn't have Laura involved. I didn't have HR involved. I sort of went rogue and, decided I could do this, on my own because, I had a good eye for, for people, but even Jack Welch says that he gets hiring right, only, I think 1 out of 4 times. So 2 out of 4 times.
Not perfect sense. That's awesome. Great piece of advice, Mike. I appreciate it. So we're at that time of the show, man. Where can our listeners and viewers find you online? Can you let us know?
Sure. I'm on LinkedIn. As you know, I'm pretty responsive on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, both. I think my profiles may be private on Instagram and Facebook, but if you send me a note, I'm happy to, always happy to chat.
What's the website?
Interactivegov.com. Yeah. So
awesome, man. Awesome.
Yeah. And especially for veterans, man, like I love to mentor veterans, and I do it a lot. So if you're a veteran or you're somebody that just started your business and you got a question, reach out. I love talking business, as you know, and I'm always willing to give somebody a few minutes time of if I can help them sidestep a landmine or, give them a piece of advice they don't have to call a lawyer for. Not that I give legal advice, disclaimer, but one of my board of advisors was like, hey, you don't need to call a lawyer for that. Let me save you $500, So
that's cool. That's awesome.
So yeah. So if anybody, has a question, don't hesitate to reach out.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Lots of great nuggets in here. And once again, thank you for your service twice. And everybody else, thank you all for joining us. Be safe, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon. Peace.